there's no record of a bat ever having cancer.
Really?
So that's again says something different about the immunity of bats. One of the major things that happen to the immune system, you have an injury, you have the response of your T cell systems, and then you get this inflammation, you get all these swellings. One major difference is bats have lost their genes for the inflammation response. It looks as if whatever pathogens there are in bats have evolved to live in a host with an immune system that works a different way. One of the sort of characteristics we're seeing with COVID is this massive inflammation response. And it's usually the inflammation response that's killing people more than the virus.
Oh, right.
The way these things are functioning in different ways that's causing all these sort of problems with pathogens that we're getting from bats.
Thank you so much, Andy, for joining me. It's actually such an honour to get to speak to you. Les, who I'd spoken to before, connected us obviously after he told me about that paper that you guys and a lot of other really incredible people have come together to write. And so yeah, it's a real honour to get to dig into this stuff. I mean, part of what I'm trying to achieve with this channel and a lot, really, really relevant in what we'd be talking about today is taking things that we'll see in the headlines, things that are like really, things that are about environmental degradation that are becoming keywords for the regular person to talk about. We're all kind of understanding of biodiversity loss and habitat loss, and now we all know what zoonotic diseases are. Right. But I think I really want to dig into these things and really understand how they work and how it all functions and how it's all being sort of disrupted, because I think that is where I'm just so jealous of ecologists, biologists, scientists, people working in this space who have this understanding, this knowledge, and comes with that a real appreciation and a wonderment at it all, really. When you realize how complex and brilliant it all is, then I think that helps to grow an appreciation. And
this is the hardest scientific problem.
Right.
The scientific problem that will define this century. How do we understand biological complexity? Because we have a limited time to be able to understand that, because we're losing it so quickly. And yet, human life itself is dependent on all those other species, and working out how we fit in and stop messing it up is a crucial scientific problem.
Yeah. So how do you...
I also think it's the hardest scientific problem. It's much harder than the things that we perceive as being hard, because things like astronomy is done at a massive scale, but it's not, it's a bunch of rocks of different sizes whose only excitement is gravity. And similarly, the physics and the molecular things down at those tiny scales, it's not many things interacting with each other, and they don't have behavior. Whereas once we start thinking of communities and ecosystems, it's lots of different things that interact at different speeds and can change those speeds because of things like behavior. And that mathematically is a much more complicated problem than the things that physicists look at, which are done at a heroic scale, but in terms of their personal lives, are not particularly interesting objects to interact with.
Yeah, it really seems like the more I come to understand this, the less you're able to sort of put one law on anything, or one simple statement or on anything. So with physics, we have a general understanding, and all particles and all sort of, that was the wrong word to use really, all units that we may look at in that area of research sort of work within these same systems. But it seems like with ecology, with ecosystems, it's like this applies here, and we don't really know if it works the same way over here and with this species. Is that, would you say that's kind of
just as you have the periodic table that helps explain chemical interactions, can you begin to derive a similar table of interactions between species that would define the set of rules by which all the species in an ecosystem are coupled together at some point along that spectrum of possible interactions that go from viruses and their hosts through lions and zebras to plants and the water that feeds it and allows them to grow?
Okay, so it is. How has ecology changed since you started working in it?
I was lucky in two ways. In that just when I started out, it was becoming much more mathematical. And people, particularly Robert May, who passed earlier this year, I came to Princeton to work with him, and he'd just written this book, Stability and Complexity in Model Ecosystems, which was about how do we begin having a mathematics of food webs, and how can even thinking about that mathematics change the way we think about interactions between species. And at the same time, I've been working with a wonderful person, Roy Anderson, who was working with Bob May, and an English guy. They had decided that for too long, ecologists had ignored parasites. They just thought parasites and pathogens were random events that came along rather than intrinsic part of natural systems. So they started developing both an ecological understanding of parasites that they then took into looking at human diseases, uh, but also to push this agenda that you can't ignore parasites as the natural part of ecological systems. And in fact, it may be that 90% of species are parasitic on the free living species that we spend 90% of our time studying.
Right. So it was really that an emerging area then of like looking at these seemingly insignificant players and being like, oh wait, they have a hell of a lot
Just because
going
they're
on.
tiny doesn't mean they're important. And
Yeah.
with anything, the other thing, you have to do experiments to understand things in ecology. And people hadn't really done experiments. But once you start taking parasites out of a system, what happens to it? Or if you add them to a system, how does it change? And pretending they're not there because you haven't looked for them tends to give you a distorted image of what's going on.
Right. So how has it been for you the last 6 months or so when really everyone began putting eyes on this area of work and on these tiny little invisible things?
Oh, well, it's interesting. It's a sort of inversion of my normal excitement. Most of the time, I'm going off to places I really enjoy, like Serengeti and Yellowstone, to work on these long-term projects where we're looking at diseases and how they affect those ecosystems. And now it's turned inside out. I don't really leave this chair for most of the last 6 months. There's been lots of Zoom meetings to talk about what's going on with these parasites, and then working with people that I've been working with over the last 10, 20 years, as well as new people that I hadn't worked with before, to sort of say, okay, how can we pull together ideas that why did this emergence occur, and what is the risk of other pathogens coming across? Can we and what can we do to reduce the risk of that happening? And then over the last 2 years, I've got very interested in sort of economics as another dimension of ecology, or the mathematics that we use in ecology has similarities to the mathematics that they use in economics, and then huge differences. There are tricks the economists use that we haven't discovered yet, and there's tricks we use that they haven't discovered yet. So it was also saying, well, if we're going to make an argument about these other diseases, we need to work with economists to say what's the cost of these pathogens and what's the cost of stopping.
Is this a way of is this a method for sort of predicting and understanding these things, or is this more about predicting and understanding what would happen in the world once pathogens get out?
I think I always split predicting and understanding.
Right, right.
You can very broadly predict things, but the tendency when you use mathematics is to think you can predict things very explicitly. Whereas I think we can use statistics things to predict things with better confidence than if we didn't use them. But also, we tend to use the mathematics for understanding things. I always think of it as for years, centuries, biologists used microscopes to look at the tiny detail. We now use molecular biology to look at tiny detail. We use mathematics as a macroscope to see the bigger scale picture. Things, when you've got lots of things interacting with each other, you need a mathematical framework to do the experiments you haven't got enough time to do, or the spatial scale to do in the wild, but you can do them on the computer and see how your mathematical model responds to those perturbations and how much of reality have you captured within that mathematical model.
Right. So where have you been working on this with?
Well, what we've been doing is a bunch of things. Is looking at past uh, outbreaks of disease that have spilled over from wildlife. How often have those occurred? And what has been the magnitude, and what have people done to stop them, or have we just been lucky? Have they just sort of faded out?
Right.
How many possible things are out there that might be possibly spill over in the future? And who gets exposed to those, and how often do they get exposed to them?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then those people who are being exposed, what sort of things are they doing? Such as people working in the wildlife trade, sort of feeding food and supposed medical substances into markets. What about people working as rainforests get chopped down? They're getting exposed to things we may not have seen before. Those
Right.
seem to be two of the major routes by which we've new pathogens have established in the course of the last 50 years to a century. The
Mm.
other way we've been getting things is sort of agricultural intensification. Tropical deforestation is a major component of that because lots of it gets converted into agricultural land for cattle or for growing soy in the Amazon or for growing palm oil trees in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So there is a cost and benefit. If we've got 6 to 9 billion people on the planet, we've got to feed them, and it's a question: do you convert more land from forests to agricultural land to do that, or do you make agriculture more efficient on the land we have?
Mm.
And if by making it more efficient, you start cutting corners, how much does that risk pathogens that may already be ticking over taking off in humans?
Mm-hmm.
And so lots of the things that are giving, the E. coli infections and things are just coming from the intensification of agriculture. The mad cow disease in Britain was just cutting corners within agriculture. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so that's again a third major source of new.
It makes sense that food is like the one of the key here because that's most of the way that we interact with animals, right? With wild animals and domesticated animals. Yeah,
Right.
we
Yeah.
just we and that's how they get into us. So this is one of the big headlines I was sort of thinking about. Is it came out, you know, people, ecologists have been shouting about this for a decade or more, right? That habitat loss and the loss of biodiversity is going to increase the numbers of zoonotic diseases, and then our interactions with them, we just bring them closer to us. But how does that really work?
Well, it's as with anything that's complicated. You want to break it down into its constituent parts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, what are people doing that might expose themselves to those things? Is it butchering them, as we've seen with sort of HIV came across because people were sort of butchering primates and rather, just on the recently chopped down trees,
Mm-hmm.
and you cut yourself when you're chopping it, when you're dissecting a primate to chop it up for the pot, and your blood gets connected with its blood, and you start picking up these weird infections.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, when people are moving bats around to sell in the wildlife markets, aggregating all these bats together and putting them in cages with other things, they're deeply stressed. They're releasing all sorts of viruses in their feces and urine, and
Right.
it exposes species that weren't previously exposed to them, and it probably exposes the people in the trade to them. And
Mm-hmm.
that itself was a double-edged sword because some of the figures that we've been looking at suggest that if you handle 500 to 1,000 bats in the course of the year, which is easily possible for people in this trade, you're going to get exposed to 50 to 80 different viral infections. So that suggests that turns the whole thing. This isn't an unusual event that this virus has come
Yeah.
across. They're trying to come across all the time, and either they don't take off, they have to be subtly different to take off, or the people, the people in the trade get exposed to so many of them that they've got massive levels of herd immunity in that tiny proportion of the population, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just the people they sell the things to, or the people who are visiting the markets out of curiosity, are the ones that first get exposed. And then it
Right.
sort of begins to take off in the people who haven't been exposed to them, and then gets into the general population. But we don't know
Right.
that. But it suggests a bunch of things we could do to try and find out more about that.
are these diseases, these pathogens, sort of like mutating all the time, or is it quite difficult for a virus to jump from one species to another? Is it quite taxing?
That pattern, I mean, there's two questions there. That pattern of there being lots of them out there and the people working in the trade more than likely exposed to a lot of them suggests they don't jump across a lot of the time. They're not particularly good. And we know this from the sort of more traditional work of parasitologists, where you're looking at wormy things that you can actually see. Now, I don't know if you've ever had swimmer's itch, where you go swimming in a river and you get this little infection and you're scratching all the time.
I mean, it could be anything, right?
Well, it's the sacarial stages of some fish parasite that lives part of its life cycle in a snail. They produce these free living stages in the water. It'll try and infect anything it comes in contact with. Most of the time, because we're not swimming, it'll be a fish and it'll be fine. It'll get into the fish. But if it gets into you, it'll just wander around underneath your skin thinking, this is not a fish, and your body will produce an immune response to it, and you'll scratch a bit because it's, you know, like a mosquito bite, except it's under your skin. But it's going to die. You're not going to get infected.
Right.
So lots of the viruses are like that. They will either not be able to establish at all, or your immune response will pick up, this is something weird, shut it down, we can do that. But occasionally you have people who are immunocompromised, which I think can get started, or from whatever it was in before, you're sufficiently similar to that thing that it can take off. Or you have tissues in a different part of your body that are similar to the tissues that it's used to being in whatever its bad host is, and then it takes off like that.
Right. So that's why chimps are quite a dangerous one then, because we share a lot of. Okay.
We're more of a danger to chimps than they are to us. Deeply worried that people with COVID might go and visit the chimpanzees in the wild, or particularly the mountain gorillas, because there's so few of them, and their immune systems and physiology is so similar to humans, because we're only like 8 to 12 million years split apart from them, that it could eradicate the remaining chimp and gorilla population. So that's a big worry.
Yeah, definitely. So there is then a really quite a big difference between animals like chimps, gorillas, who are quite close to us, and then animals that are more like the mosquito or the bat. Are they carriers of the disease rather than actually being infected in that way?
Well, again, it goes back to this sort of renaissance in ecology. Everything has a bunch of parasites in it. Ecologists have essentially studied free living species, but free living species are just little patches of habitat for maybe 10 to 20 different species of parasites and pathogens living in those. So there's a whole ecology going on. And indeed, we hear a lot about the microbiome recently. That is the bacterial and fungal bunch of species you have, community of species living in your gut and on the surface of your skin that aren't doing you any harm, but may also be actively protecting you from parasites. And in fact, we've heard a lot about the immune system and how that gets perturbed by COVID. The equivalent in plants, the immune system of plants, is actually sets of fungi and bacteria that live in the plant that self-organize as an immune system that recognize things that have tried to attack the plant before and can control it.
Wow.
So a plant is really a community of organisms that have this symbiotic community living in them, that have organized as an immune system with all the same components as the vertebrate immune system. They've got memory, non-self recognition of things that they've seen before, and they don't want attacking the host plant. So it's a very funky. Once you start looking at nature, you can see why we're amazed by it all the time.
Yeah, this is
exactly. A really hard. It's amazing natural history, but it turns into an amazing mathematical problem. How could that evolve? And how do those things coexist together like that?
That is incredible. I had no idea about that. And it makes sense, actually, because like you said, we are not one being. We have, what is it, like 2 kilograms or something of bacteria living in us? And that's exactly it. Yes, you can, once you start seeing these things and it makes you think about something else and then find those answers there. So
Magical moment of the British Ecological Society moment one year when a particularly wonderful sort of patriarchal type person was giving a speech. He said, you know, it's amazing. It's only recently I discovered that if you look at human beings, that more than 10% of us is made up of bacteria. And there's a voice in the back as well. Depends how full of shit you are, really. It's best not to keep that on the broadcast.
no,
Yes, we are full of bacteria.
yeah, full of it. Oh, that is so incredible.
Yeah.
So plants, obviously, like they're far too far away from us for anything they have as disease to track over. Where does that kind of, where's the sort of limit to that? Because how do bats carry diseases that we can get?
Okay. There's two components to that.
Always.
Well, we'll go to that. The thing with plants that I think is the tragedy is that plants are fantastically good, particularly using these symbiotic bacteria and fungi to control the viruses, bacteria, and fungi that are attacking plants.
Mm-hmm.
As we said earlier, one of the reasons we seem to be getting these new pathogens, a lot from bats, but also from small mammals, is because we're chopping down tropical rainforests and exposing the humans doing that to the bats and the plants. But the double side to that tragedy is many of the drugs we might need to control these new pathogens of humans may be derivatives of those compounds that are in those plants. And every time we lose, a square mile of rainforest, we've lost, 10 potential new drugs that we could use to treat people. And we know we will eventually get a vaccine for COVID, but before we have a vaccine, we need a treatment, because if people are going to test the vaccine, they want to know that there's some treatment that can protect them if the vaccine doesn't work. And losing all those plants is a loss of many compounds that might be potential drugs to treat these virus and bacteria infections with. So that's one side that it's a double win in not chopping down the forest. We retain a huge biological store of potential chemicals that we know are active against the things that are attacking plants, which are saying a broad class of organisms. And we also increase the risk of exposure to those things. Now, the bats are really interesting because although the bats have as many pathogens as the mice and the cattle and the goats and things like that, bats have a different type of immune system. Because, as we've learned about immunity over the course of the last century, we know that lots of immunity is driven by B cells and T cells. And the B cells are produced in your bones, in your bone marrow. T cells often come from your thymus, which is why we worry about people once you get over 60, your thymus starts atrophying, so you can't produce as many T cells, and eventually you're just going on the store of T cells you have, which means you're much more susceptible to novel pathogens than people who've still got a very functioning thymus.
Right.
Now, bats and the rest of so all mammals have bones, and they all have thymuses. But if you're a flying mammal like a bat, your bones are hollow. So you don't have B cells, which means your immune system has to work in a subtly different way. Turns out the only place you have bone marrow if you're a bat is in your hips, because whatever the bat's equivalent of hips are, that is at the center of gravity. So it doesn't matter that it's heavier because everything else tips around that. So you produce B cells, but a much, much, much lower level. Similarly, you don't want a heavy thing like a thymus up on your head, because that protects it. So that atrophies within the first couple of weeks of a bat's life, which means that B cells and T cells, that are the major components of immune system in the vertebrates that we've studied, which is like humans, mice, chickens, and dogs and cows, operate differently in bats. And we're just beginning to sort of tease this apart. Literally 20 years ago, we had 3 or 4 people on the planet who'd ever worked on bat immunity. Yeah, they all knew each other. And they could
Yeah, I bet.
but
Best of friends.
it meant our understanding of it compared to what we knew about the immunity of mice was incredibly limited. It's an interesting discussion. Well, how good is a mouse as a model of the immune system for humans when they're orders of magnitude different and stuff? Now, also, bats are really unusual in that they live much longer so a mouse will live what 2 or 3 months at most. A bat that's the same weight as a mouse will live 10 or 20 years.
Really?
Yeah,
I
they're very, very long lived. Partly because if you're flying, you don't have as many predators, but also there's no record of a bat ever having a cancer of any form. The ones that are kept in zoos or ones that wildlife, but people who work on wildlife, they've never found. So that's again says something different about the immunity of bats.
Yeah.
So with a student I had, Cara Brook, and various other people have been looking at how the bat immune systems work. In fact, fantastic researchers in Hong Kong have shown, well, one major difference is bats have lost their genes for the inflammation response.
Oh,
So
okay.
one of the major things that happen to the immune system, you have an injury, you have the response of your T cell systems, and then you get this inflammation, you get all these swellings and things.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
never happens if you're a bat. So it looks as if whatever pathogens there are in bats have evolved to live in a host with an immune system that works a different way. Which means when those viruses, predominantly viruses, but it could also be bacteria, if those go from a bat into a non-flying mammal species, humans or other apes or potentially cattle or sheep, etc., then they may not take off, but if they do, the way they'll be regulated will be very, very different.
Yeah.
And so one of the sort of characteristics we're seeing with COVID is this massive inflammation response. And it's usually the inflammation response that's killing people more than the virus.
Oh,
So it's the
right.
way these things are functioning in different ways that's causing all these sort of problems with pathogens that we're getting from bats.
So a lot of the time when you hear like it's not the virus itself that's doing the damage, it's the body's response, the overheating or whatever it may be for that particular disease. That is the case here again with COVID.
Well, I was thinking the way to think of it, the first sort of immunology lectures that I had way back from a guy called Frank Cox, he always said the way to think of the immune system is where you think of Tom and Jerry, those cartoons. The mouse is the pathogen that's got in and it's trying to find a little bit of cheese to eat and it's made a little hole in the floorboards. The cat wants to kill it, and the cat is the immune system that does all the damage. And
Right.
sometimes it catches the mouse, sometimes it doesn't, it just causes damage.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a
It
lot of it's like
destroys
that.
its own.
Yeah, a lot of the time the immune system is super efficient, but sometimes it's just been triggered to get completely out of hand, and that seems to be a lot of what's happening with COVID.
Right. So when they I don't know if this is really your area, but when they find the vaccine, is it more about sort of changing the way the body responds to the virus than
Well, I think
actually?
that's why this drug that they discovered that they use widely as an anti-inflammatory, the dexamethasone or something like that. That's why it's been so effective at treating people, that it's massively down-regulating their inflammation response.
Right.
And so if you can do that and stop the inflammation response getting completely out of control, then the immune system will take over controlling the virus without having to use this out of control inflammation.
So earlier when you said beings carry hundreds of pathogens, maybe tens of pathogens all the time, all wildlife is carrying them. It's just the body's response whether this animal is presenting as sick or not.
Yeah.
That is super interesting. I would have no idea. So when we talk about diseases that come from, say, mosquitoes or fleas or something like that, that's not the same thing where the animal is actually infected with a disease. It's more that it's carrying it in the blood that it just sucked out of another human or something like that.
It's slightly more subtle than that. Malaria would be the classic disease that we get from mosquitoes. But malaria is as much a disease of the mosquitoes as it is of humans.
Oh, right. Okay.
And in fact, malaria, it lives in the gut of the mosquitoes. It reproduces in the cells lining the gut of the mosquitoes, and then moves up to get into the salivary gland so as it can get in when the mosquito bites the humans. Because it's such a major disease of humans, we think of the vectors as not being affected by it, and try and control the vectors to control the transmission. But in many cases, and again, it's ambiguous. Sometimes some of the malarias are really detrimental to some species of mosquitoes. Sometimes it's hard to detect that impact. But malaria has been a parasite of mosquitoes for around 100 million years. So for like 98 million years before we had humans, malaria was a parasite of mosquitoes. And in many ways, from an evolutionary perspective, malaria is using sort of humans as a parking lot to get to the next mosquito, rather than it was never designed to be something that was nasty to be humans. It was designed as something that wanted to get from mosquito to mosquito, because that's where it reproduces sexually.
Right.
It reproduces asexually in humans to boost up its numbers. All the exciting bits for malaria go on in the mosquitoes rather than in the humans.
That definitely does change the way that we might look at this kind of stuff.
All those vector-borne diseases, all those insects have been around for tens of million years more than their hosts have been around. So the parasites of those have been associated with the insects for much longer than they've been associated with the vertebrates.
Right. Oh, that's a completely new.
Yeah.
So
except in the light of evolution.
Yeah. Well, so I was going to say, it sounds like a lot of these things are very old, and it's kind of been this way for a very, very long time, and things are quite split up. Are we accelerating things right now, or is it just, is it just the fear factor of everybody sort of waking up? And
no, it's both. Humans are causing major perturbation to the Earth. Every species is the fundamental thing that drives all species is their need to maximize their opportunities to reproduce and keep going. And most of the times they're doing that in the same ecosystems they evolved in. But as we go in and start perturbing those ecosystems, a lot of the time, and most of the time, those things are going to go extinct. It's devastating for them. For some species, it creates an opportunity for a new host to be colonized. And as the most increasingly common things on the planet are humans and their domestic livestock, those are opportunities for something out there to come in and say, there's a whole load of these. There's 10 of that species of monkey I'm used to living in left. Let's get into these cattle. Let's get into these dogs and cats, or there's all these humans. And if they do well in those, then it's just natural selection and operation.
Is that kind of just as easy as trying a new diet for other animals? Like, do viruses kind of are they quite malleable, or is this is no,
it? That's why I think, going back, that so few of them are able to take off. Just occasionally you'll get that lucky circumstance of something to take off. Going back, looking at the ones that roughly we get 2 new viral pathogens a year in humans, most of which we can control and get rid of. Occasionally this is the one that's taken off. Well, this is the second, at least the second in my lifetime, because HIV came across and is now endemic in humans. That came across in there. We know it became a problem in the 80s. It may have been in humans for 30 or 40 years before that, before we really knew it was a problem. COVID has come across, but similarly, we've had SARS, Nipah virus, Hendra virus, Ebola, that keep coming across, and then if we can control them, they die back out, but they're still out there waiting, and we if they get another opportunity, they come back again.
Yeah.
Similarly, influenzas are circulating. There's hundreds of species of influenza circulating in waterfowl, and then occasionally we get the right combinations when they come across.
Part of what you're doing now is working on ways to figure out how to predict and measure that.
I think what we're trying to work out is how to minimize the risk of that happening. it's one of we know it's inevitable, but we can't predict where it'll happen.
Right.
One of the guys I work with, I'm very fond of, Peter Daszak, has been going out, working fantastically to survey populations for viruses and then making maps of outbreaks and to try and say, we can make maps that'll predict where this is going to happen. And I think, no, you can gather a huge amount of useful information that will better able us to identify where it came from, but you're never going to be able to make a predictive map.
Yeah.
We had no idea this one was COVID was going to appear in China. We had no idea that the last influenza was going to appear in Mexico. We have no idea that the Ebola was going to appear in West Africa. We can't predict the location. We just have to minimize activities that make it possible.
So you were working last week when we spoke about deforestation in the Amazon, and I'm guessing that this has a lot to do with, we know that is a big factor in what's going on here. What did you sort of learn last week? What are people working on in that area?
What we were looking at last week was very much sort of vector-borne diseases, particularly the different areas in the Amazon. But there's also dengue fever there. There's Chagas disease. Definitely, the increased frequency of the diseases that we know are there, that increases with land development as they chop down forests. Initially, it's chopped down by a family moving in, but as economic incentives are provided for forest clearance, then once you move towards broader, more industrial agriculture, the risks of those diseases goes way up. And so it's like, well, is there any need to develop the Amazon for agriculture? I am not convinced we can make a big case for that. There's certainly destroying the Amazon for gold mining is a completely insane activity, particularly as the Amazon is a massive sink for carbon and a massive store of biodiversity. There may well be drugs in the trees in the Amazon for every pathogen that emerges in the course of the next 2 centuries. So losing all that reduces our ability to control it and increase our risks of getting it. A lot of, going back to the sort of original conversation we have, the big questions of the 21st century be, how can we feed everybody without losing any more biodiversity, any more pristine areas? The solution to that problem is, how do we make agriculture on the land we've already converted more efficient and prevent that land degrading in quality? And the green revolution we had in the 70s and 80s was phenomenal about that having more efficient means of growing rice meant that the population of Southeast Asia and China didn't have to destroy everything that was there and a quarter of Africa to feed itself at its current number. Having more agriculture slowed down that rate. We need to massively increase investment in research, in increasing the efficiency of agriculture, so as we can feed everybody without having to convert more land, and using that land that isn't converted as the sort of massive sink for carbon that's going to heat up the planet otherwise.
When you say degrade the land and lower the quality of the land, so high quality soil has got a lot of stuff living in it, right? Is that so? High soil health, like how would that be defined? Like it's just lots of nutrients, lots of different bacterias and things going on in there. Is this again just another example of a diverse ecosystem being the healthiest way that it can be?
That's a mix, because the most, again, and this is the sort of tragedy of tropical forests, is that most of the world's tropical forests are on relatively poor soils, because poor soils reduce competition, which allows many species to coexist. The best way to reduce diversity, you can do this experiment in your window box, is if you pour sugar in there, everything will go extinct apart from one species of bacteria. If you have a huge level of resources, then the super species that can most utilize that resources outcompetes everybody else.
Right,
Once you have
right.
low levels of resources heterogeneously distributed, that way you increase diversity. So tropical forest looks incredibly productive, but it's massively recycling everything using all these symbiotic bacterial and fungal interactions. Once you take it off and you're left to the relatively bare soil, it's only productive for corn or soy or sort of the common food stuff for very short periods of time. And similarly, it'll erode really quickly. The trees help prevent erosion. Once it's just soil and corn, it'll erode every rainy season.
Right, right. And that's the problem with monoculture areas is
I see that. I
one
mean,
thing
yeah,
can survive.
yeah. I mean, we see that in Central Valley of California, which was like the bread basket, the fruit basket of the U.S.
Mm.
That was the most. That and New Jersey, where I am now, were the two most productive regions for agriculture in the U.S. That they opened up the Great Plains for corn, but through excessive irrigation in the Central Valley of California, they poisoned the soils by bringing up by the evaporation, concentrating really poisonous salts. It's really productivity's plummeted there. In New Jersey, we converted it all to shopping malls and golf courses.
Is it fair to say that when in places like the Amazon, when these places have been turned over, one crop, and then like the land has been degraded in this way, that it's very difficult to pull it back. It can't really ever go back to being the way that it was, or it would take many hundreds of years. Is that the
Well,
way
it's
that it
interesting.
is?
The problem of scale. The interesting thing about some of the things we were doing last week and that we've been looking at over the last couple of decades is the original sort of agriculture in places like the Amazon, Indonesia, Malaysia were a family or small group of people converting an area, living in that area for a couple of years until the weeds and everything came in and made it too hard. So they'd moved somewhere else.
Mm,
And then the area they were in would recover quite quickly. And
right.
we know that within the last millennia, different parts of the Amazon that now look like pristine forest, once archaeologists have gone in and done sort of X-ray stuff from planes flying over them, there were quite large towns and villages in those areas, but they were abandoned and the forest comes back. So if you go to Tikal in Guatemala, which has all those fantastic towers coming up out of the forest where the Mayan civilization was, it only took 400 or 500 years for the forest to come back into that
Right.
region, and it's a spectacular area of forest to go and visit. So if you have lots of small patches where it can be recolonized by what's left, then it will come back quite quickly. If you clear cut it and then excessive rain and erosion takes the soil away, it'll take much longer to come back.
Right. Right.
So reducing what they're doing and leaving it as intact as possible, it's managed itself for millions of years, and it can continue to do that. But once you've lost it all, we'll have to wait a long time for it to come back.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you say that the conservation movement is obviously, I think it's a little flawed in sometimes where the emphasis and money is directed towards. There doesn't seem to be a lot of call for protecting of an entire ecosystem. Most sort of charities or
It's got to move in that direction. It's focused on specific charismatic species that were often hopeless cases for too long. You've
right.
really got to focus on saving whole communities. Partly, conservation organizations would argue, well, the reason we want to save the spotted owl is that the spotted owl could only persist in a totally intact forest. So by setting up legislation to protect the spotted owl, things like the jeopardy clauses of the United States Endangered Species Act mean that anything that you do to the forest that has a negative impact on the owl will be prosecutable. So sometimes in countries like the US, you can have laws that are effective like that. but
Hmm.
often you don't have the complexity of the legal systems that you have in the US that helps you use a species to protect an entire ecosystem. So in that case, it's better to focus on protecting the entire ecosystem. Like the
Yeah,
Serengeti, we always emphasize we're trying to save the Serengeti.
right.
Yellowstone, we say we're trying to save the ecosystem. It's iconic. We're going to do that.
Is it, do you find that that message is as easy to get across as, say, save the elephant and save the rhino?
It's never easy to get it across.
Yeah.
I would argue we've done it better. I've worked on elephants for like 30 years. It's, and we've lost half the elephants that we had 30 years ago. We've
Yeah.
got left on the planet now. It's just a constant battle. All you're doing is slowing it down. The Serengeti is as intact as it was 30 years ago. So, trying to save the whole year, it's still every 2 or 3 years, there's another major battle we have to fight. Uh, but as long as it's there, it's increasingly surrounded, but it's sufficiently big that uh, it remains above a critical level where it would start collapsing. It's being eroded around the edges, which makes us nervous, but it's still there.
As in the actual physical edges of it it's sort of shrinking the area that is still healthy.
It's when you've got so many people living outside the park, and if we have a bad rainy season, then they'll think, well, there's all that grass in the park. There's nobody. I'll just go in this edge, and then they'll go in like 10 kilometers in, and so we're seeing grazing all around the edge. And then
Right.
people think, well, we've got to eat the goat. We need some firewood. Let's go and chop some of the trees down in the park. And so you can see the edge is increasingly vulnerable. The
Right.
actual size of the park that's not encroached on is getting smaller.
And this is again going back to diseases in that we're coming closer and closer to the animals and their habitat is shrinking further
Yeah.
down.
But I think one of the reasons I sort of went back to working in the Serengeti is we had a big outbreak of disease in the lions.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
Lost about a third of the lions in the Serengeti, but it was because they got distemper from the domestic dog population living around the outside of the park. So we
Oh,
may have
right.
like 5,000 lions in the Serengeti, but there's 80 to 100,000 dogs living around the outside. And
Hmm.
if those dogs get distemper, then it can spread from domestic livestock into the wildlife.
So that is an equal threat, really, to
Oh, yeah.
what's going on here is us giving uh,
Yeah.
wildlife diseases. Is there any other cases of that happening?
Um, it's a constant battle around the edge of the park. So that sort of partly that got me very into that. The original disease I worked on in Serengeti was rinderpest, which is the equivalent, the ancestor of measles, but
Right.
disease of cattle. And that was introduced into Africa in the 1890s, probably because it was quicker to get cattle once you had steamships than when you had sailing ships. So you
Right.
could
Okay.
bring in cattle in shorter than the incubation time of rinderpest.
Hmm.
Rinderpest had been a huge problem throughout Asia and Britain, Europe, but it never got across the Sahara until you had steamships. And then once it got in, bam, all the wildebeest, the buffalo, any antelopes that were like cattle got hammered by rinderpest. And it caused the biggest pandemic ever recorded because it was multi-species. So about 80 to 90% of the game in sub-Saharan Africa died in the rinderpest outbreak. Uh,
What?
it was
Oh
massive.
my.
Yeah, the vultures were so full they couldn't take off and things like that. But
There's always something that does well out of it, huh?
but again, it gets a macro story because once and then there was a sort of flip around. So it meant it was very hard to establish cattle ranches in Kenya and Tanzania.
Hmm.
And the Brits wanted to use Kenya as a source of cattle for roast beef because it was being grown up by English people in Kenya, so it must be real roast beef. So they blamed the wildlife as being a source of rinderpest. But a super smart guy called Walter Plowright realized as soon as we had a measles vaccine, you could modify the measles vaccine and use it as a rinderpest vaccine. And then he did one of the things just by vaccinating cattle. You could get roast beef on your English table from Kenya rather than Argentina, which never had our own. But also, if you just vaccinated the cattle, the disease disappeared from wildlife because the wildlife weren't able to sustain the disease. Just if there were cattle there, it would be constantly spilling over and holding their numbers low. So it's interesting when
Right.
they set up the Serengeti in the late 1950s, this is an amazing migration. There were 10% of the wildebeest then that there are now, because once they'd eradicated rinderpest, the wildebeest could increase by a factor of 10. And no people have never seen buffalo in large areas of the Serengeti and the Ngorongoro through most of last century because rinderpest was killing them all.
So it completely changed. How did it affect the sort of like food webs around the area, the other species that
Well, it's
suffered?
a wonderful example of it completely changed the abundance of everything in the Serengeti, apart from the zebra. The zebra numbers didn't change at all, but every other species changed abundance. We don't know why that was the case, why
Yeah.
zebra don't change. But it changed the balance between grassland and woodland, because once you had
Hmm.
more wildebeest, they ate more grass, which suppressed fire, so the trees could come back. The woodland's a better place for the lions to hunt, so there was more food for the lions, and better places for them, so the
Uh-huh.
lion abundance increased. The different habitats for the birds, so the communities of birds changed completely. So the whole place changed completely. And it's quite miraculous because eventually they managed to globally eradicate rinderpest. It's only the second disease we've ever managed to eradicate. Smallpox was the first one, rinderpest
Hmm.
was the second one. And it was just thanks to vaccination they managed to get rid of it.
Yeah, that is incredible. How come that's not ever worked before? Or was it a targeted effort to eradicate it as it was with smallpox?
Yeah, it was both targeted. It was groups of people who knew each other or knew each other.
Hmm.
Plurite, developed the vaccine as a side project of his PhD thesis because the other disease he was working on, a herpes pathogen of cattle, that did the opposite thing. It's a herpes of wildebeest that affected cattle, and it's lethal to cattle, but not particularly nasty to wildebeest.
Hmm.
So because it's a herpes, it was a really, really hard virus to work on. So we thought, this
Right.
is so slow, I'll play around with this rinderpest stuff. And so
That one's
we
easy.
managed to make a career out of the side project. We still don't have a vaccine for the herpes one, which is not great.
Yeah.
But he won the World Food Prize, and he died before it was acknowledged that rinderpest was officially eradicated, but he knew it had gone because we hadn't seen a case for 4 or 5 years before he died, and then
Right.
they still have to tick all the boxes and things. But he won the World Food Prize because it's a thing that makes cattle viable as an industry, as having a rinderpest vaccine. So it's as big as that. And he's a super nice guy. That's the other sort of scary thing about all these virus diseases. Up until 20 or 30 years ago, it was only a handful of people working on them, and we all knew each other. So it's like, that's
Right.
good. It's such a fun area. We all know each other, and you go, shit, if we get a big disease, this is a problem because there's just not enough of us out there.
Yeah, it's just you. So how has that changed? Like you have your own lab at Princeton now, right? So you must have like, is that sort of like a big tick for the area of study to say like, here, have all of these resources?
Just a handful of us there. No, I'm not a believer in having a big lab. I prefer being able to go into the field with just one or two people in each of the areas working in the field. I
Mm.
it's a different sort of conversation. But these people with huge labs, how do they ever get to talk to the people in them? I prefer having one or two people that I get to spend a lot of time with, and then
Mm.
lots of people that I collaborate with, because then you see different aspects of, you learn different things from different projects and different people you work with.
Is it still, would you say it's relatively easier now to get funding and attention?
No, no.
Ah.
We put in a huge grant in they spent most of last fall writing a huge grant to the European Research Council to look at what will be the interaction between viruses and climate change for all of the countries all around the Mediterranean and East
Right.
Africa. They didn't want to fund it. It's like, we don't think forests are going to be important. And we put in another one on, we do lots of work on the evolution of these pathogens.
Mm-hmm.
We have a project, we've been looking at the evolution of an emerging disease for the last 10 years. Again, that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't funded last year either. They don't think it's like, well, fine. It's much more important to fund the people who count the bristles on the bums of Drosophilas, because I'm sure that's going to make the world a better place.
Wow, that is crazy. I
You
mean,
know, it's like you set aside a month every year to write grants for the next year, and if you don't get
right.
it, there's always other stuff you can do.
Oh, for sure. But I mean, speaking as someone who would benefit a hell of a lot from knowing the answers to your research, just in terms of I'm human and understanding these things that are a threat to us and also a threat to the earth. That's I would put my vote in and say I support your.
It's voted by a committee of our peers.
Yeah, yeah. I know I don't count for anything, but
Oh well,
it's
I'd much rather
hugely
have your
important.
vote than theirs.
It's because it's a yes. You said that you were looking at the links between these diseases and climate change. Like, so I'm guessing this is quite a scary area of work that's going on now. What are the theories?
The two major challenges of this century, what are we going to do about climate change?
Hmm.
And what are we going to do about biodiversity? And one of the most refreshing things of last year was the whole Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg finally having people taking these problems seriously and taking to the politicians and saying, this is going to ruin our lives and there's something done about it. Whereas the
Hmm.
politicians say, no, much more important that we have a healthy oil industry and all this nonsense. Those are the two biggest threats. There is, again, a sort of paradox that the best way to deal with climate change is to restore natural habitats and protect things like the Amazon and the Serengeti, because they are much more efficient at sucking carbon out of the atmosphere than anything we can do to slow down the rate at which we put it back.
Hmm.
I know that there's a huge focus on let's all have electric cars, let's all do this, but we've still got more CO2 in the atmosphere and more going up than we've ever had before. So
Hmm.
nothing that we do to stop, if we could stop putting CO2 up in the atmosphere this afternoon, it would still get warmer for another 25 years because of what we've already
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
We want to get that CO2 out of the atmosphere and bring it back. And the best way to do that is forests, restoration of natural land, because all those plants suck CO2 out. If we get it into the soil, then that's a good way to do it. So
Hmm.
there's the reversing it is much more important than stopping it. Now that's one
Hmm.
side. So that's the sort of, and it also means not losing biodiversity is really important because biodiversity brings all these other people. Will be a threshold when we don't have enough forests to clean the water we need for agriculture and all the other human needs we have for water. And that's a
Hmm.
big problem. So
Hmm.
it's desperate to do something about that. That's why I think the Extinction Rebellion is the most important political movement of this century.
Yeah,
Greta,
it's been Greta is
is a role
yeah.
model for us all.
Yeah.
But then there's a sort of slightly nerdy scientific problem of what is climate change going to do to diseases?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
there, it affects a subset of diseases. Most sharply, it affects the vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue fever, because they're the rate at which the pathogens develop in the mosquitoes is temperature dependent.
Oh, right.
And the size of the mosquito populations is rainfall dependent. So if we know what's going to happen with temperature and what's going to happen with rainfall, which is a much harder problem, we would know much more what's going to happen with those diseases.
Right.
So trying to understand that is quite tricky, but it's an interesting thing that's a solvable problem. And then there's fantastic groups of people working on
Hmm.
that. The other sort of strange thing we have is that there's this big worry about this mean temperature going up, but it's
Hmm.
hugely asymmetrically distributed. It's getting warmer slowest in the tropics, where those infectious diseases are most prevalent. it's getting warmer most rapidly at the poles. So
Right.
losing the poles is going to be the big, because having the polar ice caps melt will cause flooding all over the planet. And of course, you've got more water, that's going to give you more mosquitoes as well. So that's an aspect of it.
And that really changes the ecosystems around the coast, right?
Yeah,
Like a change in water balance changes the ecosystem entirely almost.
yeah, yeah. The salinity changes can cause you all sorts of problems. So it's like this is an urgent problem, and we have a very increasingly narrow window of time in which to do anything about it.
Right, yeah. But you were saying that the temperature is increasing slowest in the tropics, so it's quite difficult to sort of say what that may mean for diseases and pathogens that emerge out of there, or is it, or we can we still say it's going to make a big difference?
We don't. Again, it's going to be different. The problem with it, I don't think it's going to change the rate at which diseases emerge. The
Okay.
deforestation and the wildlife change are the drivers of those diseases coming out. What it is going to change the distribution of the diseases that we already have that cause lots of suffering. Things like malaria. Now, we still lose the equivalent of 9/11 every day with kids dying of malaria in Africa. Now, one of the weird things about malaria, again, you go back to your immune system, the first time you get malaria is the worst time. That's usually when it kills you. After that, you've got some immunity and you get really sick, and it's a constant source of debilitation. But unless you have wealthy parents and go off to the West and get educated and come back and lose that immunity, then you get really sick and might die again. Um, the problem, therefore, is that the distribution of malaria is going to change. It's going to be able to move into areas where people have not been exposed to it before. And as I say, the biggest worry is when you get it for the first time. So as it moves into areas where it hasn't been before, people are going to get it for the first time, and that's when they're going to get really sick.
Right, right. Oh, that sounds really scary. I
We're all
wasn't
isolated and not going
really
out.
sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, they can come in. What kind of research is going on in your lab? You say you like to work really closely with, your postdocs and your students. So, what are you working on at the moment?
Well, I say, thanks to COVID, we've been looking a lot at emerging diseases. The, the, the other things that I've really been focusing on is trying to look at this whole interaction between land use change, agriculture, and economics, and to set in place a group of people to work on that. So we're trying to set up a center where, over the course of 4 or 5 years, a group of us work on underlying theory that will allow us to look at that at a range of different problems. Mainly in countries around the Mediterranean, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and then Tunisia, Morocco. Because how is agriculture going to change around the Mediterranean will have huge effects about how people move around and how stable Europe is. And then could we also, within that mathematical framework, look at things like the Amazon, where we're at this stage of chopping down forests, and East Africa, where the savannas are being lost. So can we have a general economic, epidemiological, ecological framework for looking at that, which is a sort of
Wow.
nice nerdy problem. And
Yeah.
then I still have to do things that are just pure biology. So I'm very interested in. I have a project looking at the wolves in Yellowstone and how does living in social groups affect your susceptibility to different types of diseases, and what are the population dynamics of living in social groups rather than just living in a homogenous population, and how does that affect the types of diseases that can establish and the impact that those diseases have on you.
Do you find, are you sort of predicting that you'll find with social groups more sort of like STDs and that kind of disease, than you?
It's the other way around. It's a perfect
Oh, really?
Republican convention this week. that if you were the ultimate solitary carnivorous predator living by yourself, the only diseases you'd ever have would be sexually transmitted diseases. Because the
Right.
only time you ever meet another member of your species is to mate. You're never
Hmm.
living in a big enough social group to be able to support transmission. It's
Right.
not until you live in big herds that you actually can sustain non-sustainable, non-sexually transmitted disease.
Right.
And
That
you know,
makes
similarly,
sense.
if you look at different human societies or diseases in the course of human history, it's not until people start living in cities that we
Hmm.
start getting things like measles, influenza, um, chickenpox, things like that. When we were sort of solitary, wandering around, or living like the Hadza or the bush people in Namibia and places like that, there they're mainly getting STDs and things like that, or vector-borne diseases like malaria, because there it's dependent on the size of the mosquito population. This is
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So once we start, the same as us and wildlife that carry
yeah,
diseases, once we start interacting with them and more than one level, interacting with each other in different ways. And in cities, I mean, yeah, you're sharing every
yeah.
part of the infrastructure. You're sharing the water, the sewage systems, and that's where
Where it's like that whole
these.
Napoleon noticed that this whole business of seasoning the troops comes from Napoleon. That if he had these scrawny, underfed kids commissioned into the military, they'd do fine. But if you got these healthy kids from the farm districts, they'd die in the first week because they'd never been exposed to any of the diseases that all the scrawny kids from the city had, and it would just kill them like flies, literally. So you had to sort of
Right.
not let them go into battle for a couple of weeks so as they could get over being sick from all the things they hadn't lived because they lived in the country.
Oh, right. So we've kind of known about this, before modern medicine really like taught us all of these things properly. Didn't the quarantine come from ships parking up and having to
Yeah,
like
yeah.
isolate
Isolate, yeah,
for.
with a yellow flag to show if they had yellow fever or plague on board. But there's a
Oh,
lot of it in
right.
McNeil's book on plagues and people from the 1960s. Now, it's a
Mm,
fantastic insight into disease and the role it's played in human history.
mm,
But it's sort of on the other hand, there is a whole area of history that deals with disease, but it's incredibly resistant to thinking of it as a mathematical problem.
yeah.
It writes about all the social implications, but it does say, but you have to have a population of a certain size or certain levels of connection before these diseases establish.
Yeah. So there. Wow, that's so interesting. What do you think maths and statistical analysis of these problems could add to history in the history of disease?
Mathematics is a wonderful macroscope. It gives you a way of looking at things and asking questions about how
Mm,
do things work.
mm,
It's that's why I think we don't. It's a bit dangerous to use it for prediction, but for using it for dissection and getting at the mechanisms of how these things work, it's an incredibly powerful tool. Because
mm.
any mathematical model has to have assumptions, and those have to be asking questions to determine, is this piece of math I put in here, what does it mean biologically? What does it mean medically? What does it mean immunologically?
And looking at numbers can sort of bring out things that only looking at more human sort of social factors would have passed over.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think of it as numbers, I think of them as curves. It's like, what is the relationship between this and that? That is a curve. How do I characterize that curve? Because that'll be something that determines the way it interacts with another curve in that mathematical model.
Well, it was your paper that sort of looked at the economic cost of the pandemic so far versus what it would have cost um,
Yeah,
to prevent it from happening that drew me in. So that's really interesting. There's so many little like examples of these things happening, and like just hearing about them helps paint the picture, and then it helps the regular person like me try and just
yeah,
see like understand what it means beyond just the words, right? So
right.
It's wonderful to hear. So thank you so much for that.
All right,
Cool.
good to talk with you.
Thank
Enjoy
you
the rest of
so
your day.
much. Have a
My
great good
pleasure.
day.
Fun to talk with you.
Bye. And you. See ya.